Hey, I'm Dr. Ruth Roberts. I am so excited to have with me today Jason Klopp from Legacy Biome. For those of you that don't know him, he is the founder of Legacy Biome, which is a company revolutionizing the way we think about canine health, one tail wag at a time. With a passion for microbiome science and over 7 years of experience in FMT or fecal microbiota transplant field, Jason's on a mission to deliver cutting edge solutions for our furry companions. At Legacy Biome, Jason works with a unique donor network, genetically tested, antibiotic-free, and living their best lives in pristine, chemical-free environments. These donors truly set the gold standard for FMT products, ensuring safety, efficacy, and a touch of holistic care for dogs everywhere. So whether you are a veterinarian, a holistic pet health coach, or a pet parent that's just trying to figure out what is up with this, you're in the right place. So Jason, welcome. So glad to have you here.
Thank you. I'm really excited for our discussion today.
Me too. And for everybody's frame of reference, just so you know kind of where this is coming from, Jason and I met some years ago when I was exploring fecal microbiome transplant for myself. And so Jason came from the human side and did some amazing work supporting children and people to have a much better quality of life. And so you've taken that. And I remember talking with you then. Yeah, I'm talking to Dr. Margot Roman to see if we can do something for dogs. And so here we are, 4 years later, 3 years later. Right on, Lisa. That's it.
Right. So pretty serendipitous. I know. It's funny because then we ended up meeting at the AHVMA, and I guess that was last fall, and it was really cool to come full circle at that point. And I think that was really the interesting part for me, having spent, and I'm still very much involved in the human FMT world, not actively treating patients, but we supply our products, which are considered a drug, very heavily regulated, and we export them around the world for physicians and so on. But it was really interesting to make that connection between what we've seen in the human world, which was a really high quality donor network, is critical to the outcomes, and seeing what was happening in the animal world and just making that translation. So it was the combination of our experience in manufacturing as well as the realization of the importance of a really good, clean donor network, which is ultimately what you just talked about prior to this in the intro.
Right on. And so we mentioned Dr. Margot Roman was one of the OGs in the FMT world. Yes. And veterinary medicine. And in fact, back in probably 10, maybe 12 years ago, there was an epidemic of C. diff in the humans and unfortunately in the pets as a result. And so she actually was training internists on how to do FMT transplants because it was this new in the world. So she's been in this field for a very long time. And let's talk a little bit about what is different in terms of how she raises dogs and guides them through their lives to be this gold standard of FMT source.
Yeah, I mean, I think she does a lot of things very uniquely. One advantage she has is that she's been raising the same sort of brood, if you will, of dogs for generations. I think she's at her 8th generation now, which spans a period of about 30 years. And she's been raising them holistically, naturally rearing them ever since. And so they're getting an exposure ongoing from the grandmother to the mother to the daughter. And so there's this generational microbiome that she's been protecting. And it's almost akin, although of course it's different, but to the tribes that exist in some of these countries where they're untouched by human civilization. I mean, she really has them in this bubble in a way where they're not exposed to any chemicals, pesticides, antibiotics. And she's been raising them this way for a very long time. And so I know there's been research groups that have actually studied her dog's microbiome because they're trying to understand, what a full spectrum healthy microbiome really looks like, and not, falling to all of the conventional stuff, which we know damages the gut microbiome, right? A single dose of antibiotics can take years to recover from a microbiome standpoint. Same with a lot of the, standard things like flea and tick medicines. And then the diet, like she's literally making the food for the dogs, a human grade type diet for this whole time. And that's a huge commitment, right? I mean, most people, including myself, who have 2 dogs that I love, I buy most of their food. It's just a lot easier for me to buy it in a nice little puck and then add some supplements and other things to the dish. But she literally makes all of the food. And her emphasis is a lot more on a plant base as the foundation for the diet. And I think there's reasons for that. She has a variety of reasons, but a big role that plays is actually supporting a broader microbiome, because bacteria in the gut, which there's, a lot of them, actually grow and thrive and produce their metabolites through exposure to fibers. So they actually help us digest and break down fibers. And so when you're having a really broad diet like the one she pushes and feeds her dogs, you're actually getting a better, stronger, more diverse gut microbiome, which has a lot of health benefits.
Right on. And I mean, she and I are definitely on that same wavelength. And it is definitely not popular to say this right now, but I really believe that if the dog tolerates well beans, greens, lots and lots of veggies and a variety of veggies, these, along with healthy animal proteins, are really the foundation of health. I think what's happened is, I don't know that we truly know what an excellent microbiome looks like, because we're all starting from some banged up version that's been de-diversified and de-enriched over the years, just because of the way that we are producing food, we are producing chemicals, et cetera, et cetera. Do you think that's a fairly accurate statement? Or
Yeah, no, I agree completely. I mean, we don't even, again, my background, as you alluded to, is really in human healthcare. And even in that, we did this microbiome project where we were studying, all of these different people's microbiome to see if we can figure out, like, what is standard, what is good, what is healthy. We still don't know the answer to that after having, looked at thousands of these cases as a part of this human microbiome project. And ultimately, it's changing all the time. In a 24-hour period, it's going to shift. And there's a lot of factors that come into play, right? It's the time of the month for the dog, so hormonal influences, there's sleep influences, there's stress influences, there's diet influences. There's a lot of factors that are sort of constantly manipulating the microbiome. And the importance of the microbiome is that it can have an effect on all body systems, and the immune system being a big part of that. There's a huge interaction between the immune system and the dog's gut microbiome. And so a lot of the diseases that dogs are dealing with are, inflammatory or autoimmune in nature. And a lot of that, again, ties back to the gut microbiome. And so that's why it's such an important piece to be paying attention to as a part of overall well-being for the dog. And of course, if they're experiencing overt symptoms, it makes even more sense. But a lot of people, they just think, oh, well, I'll think about the microbiome or gut health when my dog's dealing with the symptoms. But the reality is it's tied to everything. And we've studied this in humans where it's, microbiome, gut brain connection. Everybody kind of understands that. But there's a gut connection to virtually everything, a gut bone connection, a gut heart connection, a gut lung connection. It just ties into everything. And it's really, really fascinating.
it is. It really is astonishing. And so, the whole idea that the gut is the second brain, actually, maybe we should revisit that and say it's the first brain. And then this one does the higher level processing. And that's not quite accurate, but I think that
I don't disagree, right? I mean, in many ways, it drives a lot of behaviors. So yeah, you have an override switch, which is the brain on top. But if you're just driven by your gut instincts, things can be very different in a good way and or a bad way. So yeah, there's definitely, you have the ability to control through the sort of higher processing. But at the same point, like even, people with addictions, even food addictions, right? They're often driven by an imbalance in the microbiome. You can just take sugar addictions or carbohydrate addiction. Like you have a fungal population within your gut that's demanding it be fed because they want to live like everything. all of the bacteria, all the fungus, all of the viruses, they want to live, right? And we see this in humans, and now even more in animals and our pets as well with these viruses. Like, they're not a virus that stays super strong for a long time because they don't want to kill the host. They want the host to limp along. And so I think more and more we are driven by the microbiome. And this is, again, why it's important to pay a lot of attention to it and to protect it. I mean, ultimately, that's the start, right? It's always like, how do we protect what we have? And then how do we improve it over time?
Right on. And I think this is incredibly critical for pets because in the United States, the majority of them are spayed or neutered, and many of them as young as 8 weeks of age. And so they never have a competent endocrine system. And my guess is that they never have a competent microbiome unless that pet parent is really, really vigilant about supporting it and re-inoculating it.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I mentioned it just earlier, right? But the impact of the hormones on the gut microbiome, the development of the gut microbiome, as well as the other sex and endocrine organs, right? Yeah, I think that's a real tragedy. A lot of it just out of convenience. I know it is a pain. We got 2 female dogs, and it's annoying when they go into heat and they're bleeding around the house. But yeah, just understanding the impact of that. And even, I mean, more about this, obviously, but just delaying it can have a significant impact. And so, yeah, I think that's definitely something to consider. We have actually seen some pet parents who choose to use, some cases they buy a dog from their breeder or they get it rescued and it's already been spayed. And then just by supporting their microbiome, following the procedure and ongoing is really big. And I know Dr. Margot Roman talks a lot about that, like how she'll use microbiome from her dogs who are in heat to treat another dog that's been neutered or spayed, and that has a real impact from her observation. So could be something there for sure.
That is super interesting, because when dogs are in heat, that's one of the few times that their estrogen levels are high.
Right.
Most of the time for intact females, they're in high progesterone levels. And so it sounds like that would kick things up. That's very, very cool. It makes a great deal of sense. So, and this is it. I mean, I've talked for several years about spay-neuter syndrome, and there is this interrelationship between what gets made in the microbiome in terms of neurotransmitters, immune system regulators, that kind of stuff, when you have a competent endocrine system versus when you don't. And so I think this may be one of the things that we use along with a healthy whole food diet, detoxification strategies to help keep that pet that's been spayed or neutered healthy for the long run, because it's so horrifying. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's just an interesting thing too, though. You mentioned the long run, right? And I think generally speaking, there's a lot more attention being paid now to longevity, but not only living a long time, but actually living a really quality life for a longer period of time. And that's a really interesting aspect. And just naturally, as one ages, both human and dog or cat, your microbiome just declines. Both you're being exposed for a longer period of time to the environmental things that we know damage the gut, but also it's just a natural part of aging. And there's some really fascinating studies that have been done in humans, just looking at these blue zones where people live a very long time. And most of them are actually gardening. They're spending time in nature. They're getting their hands dirty, and they're not, washing them instantly and or wearing gloves all the time. And so, of course, there's a lot of factors that go into living that length of time. But I do think that the sort of over sterilization of our world creates problems, and we're just not exposing ourselves to enough. And even, these studies have been done with families that have pets in the home. The children don't develop atopic diseases nearly as frequently as kids who aren't exposed to broader diversity. And so, yes, you might not want your dog, rummaging through garbage. That might be a bad thing. But even just getting them into nature, right? Letting them swim, letting them get exposure to lake water and mountain, stuff in the woods and chewing on bark and all of the things. That's where the microbiome originally came from. It came from the earth. That's the original microbiome. And so from an environmental standpoint, that should be our MO, is like, how do we support the earth microbiome so that we as beneficiaries of that can expose ourselves to it and get advantage. And when I speak at conferences and things, I sort of joke, but it's true. I tell people, hug a tree, get in nature, literally hug a tree. It's going to be good for you. Because you're exposing yourself to the tree's microbiome and you're getting yourself a little dirty, and that's a good thing.
I agree. I mean, there's, this gets called the hygiene hypothesis, but it turns out that in creating these essentially sterilized environments where, there's pesticides, herbicides, everything that's killed off all of the normal inhabitants of our backyards, for instance, we've ended up destroying the diversification of the planet's microbiome in doing this. So I think you're making a really critical point. It's not just what's in the gut, it's where everything else is coming from. So
we see this with the issues of monocrops and farming this way, right? If you're damaging the integrity of the soil and the soil structure, you just aren't growing a nutrient dense, rich food. And that same concept of this, foundation and the structure of the bacteria and the interplay of the whole microbiome in the soil translates directly to what's happening in the gut. And so when you start to break that down and the integrity of the gut, you create problems and you're unable to actually utilize the nutrients out of the food, even if it is a really high quality food.
And that's a whole nother piece of the puzzle there as well. It's like, we'll just add digestive enzymes, and they do help, but it's not the entire picture, because if the community in your intestines is not able to process the food, then and you've already got some intestinal permeability or leaky gut, then that just compounds the problem in terms of destroying the microbiome further, because there's all this stuff that's not broken down appropriately that's damaging the bugs, damaging the intestinal cells, and just accelerating that process of
it's
dysbiosis,
ultimately creating inflammation, right? And when you have inflammation, as you pointed out, you can start getting this gut permeability, leaky gut situation. And now you have this inflammation leaking throughout the body, and the dog's experiencing symptoms, whether it's joint pain or could be even behavioral things because of this gut-brain connection. I mean, we see that all the time in humans, so it only makes sense that the same thing's happening in dogs. And that's, I think, a big part of how, truthfully, we don't really understand how FMT actually works. We have a lot of theories. They're good. They're not totally understanding how or why precisely FMT works. But I think a big part of why it works or how it works is in part healing up that gut permeability, but also actually lowering inflammation in the gut. Because when you have the right balance of bugs in the gut, the full microbiome, not just bacteria, we're talking about the full spectrum that includes bacteria, fungus, virus, parasites, and all of the other metabolites that come with it. When you have that correct balance, you're actually lowering inflammation. And dysbiosis ultimately is this imbalance, right? It's this imbalance of the bugs where you can get too much, even of good bacteria or fungus. Like fungus are normal, they're there. It's just that when you get too much of them, they've overgrown. And this is something, kind of using our soil analogy. That's what happens in soil is you get weeds, and fungus are a lot like weeds. But if they're not there, and this is where, I caution people about trying to kill everything, right? Don't try to kill everything. The fungus is actually there to maintain, and the weeds, to maintain the integrity of this structure. Because if you, for example, you had a plot of soil that you were going to grow a garden on and you weeded everything off and you didn't plant anything there, well, with the rain and the wind and everything, you're going to lose the topsoil. You're going to lose this structure. But the weeds actually maintain and hold the structure together. So yes, they are pesky, but they're maintaining. They're like trying to hold on to what is. And I think fungus is very much the same. And so it's really important to be cautious about just trying to kill all the fungus without actually trying to rebuild the gut microbiome, because they're trying to maintain the structure. And without them, we could end up with bigger problems. So on their own, yes, they're problematic, but they're only problematic because there's nothing there to oppose them. There's no good bacterial balance that would otherwise just crowd them out. It's kind of like if you plant corn in your garden, they grow up and it just crowds out the bad stuff. There's still going to be weeds around them, but ultimately it's when you have an imbalance, not just of bad stuff, but just too much of one or a few strains, you don't have this, balance that gets rid of or reduces the likelihood or the ability of even pathogenic bugs to take effect. And C. diff is a perfect example of this, right? You mentioned this epidemic of C. diff. You mentioned 10, 15 years ago. It's still happening. And it's only getting worse. Antibiotic resistance is just growing at an alarming rate. And that's really what's happening is people get C. diff and dogs as well, often following antibiotics. So you're killing off good stuff, and it's allowing this pathogenic strains that may be there, but just in really low levels that our body can manage, and then they grow up. And if you combine that with a unhealthy immune system or an aging pet, it just makes it that much worse.
Right on. And I think what kicked all of that C. diff off was fast food companies had started adding trehalose, which is a type of sugar, to ground beef to do something with flavor enhancement. But ultimately, that particular artificial sugar selected and selectively fed the C. diff organisms. And so it just took off like a bat out of hell. And unfortunately, it's led to antibiotic resistance. Even during that time, it was starting to be an issue. And it is miserable, and just really not fun. But so we just went down the garden path and totally geeked out. So let's back up about 12 steps. And it's interesting you said that we don't really know how FMT works, but let's talk first about how we've got the donor dogs that are amazing. How does their poop actually get turned into the product that's used by pets?
Yeah, and I think, I've been working hard to sort of rebrand the image that is FMT. I mean, FMT is, with the name, is Fecal Microbiota Transplant, but it's more than that, or it's less than that, whichever way you think about it. But, Microbiota Transplant is a better way, because fecal actually contains a lot of stuff in it that doesn't have any benefit from like a medicinal standpoint. And so fiber makes up a large portion of the stool. And so ultimately, the processing that happens is removing a lot of the fiber and other waste products that aren't going to have a direct benefit and that you can easily get from a food. And so that is what processing is. It's refining the stool sample into something that is concentrating for the microbes, the microbiome that exists within that sample. And that is ultimately what gets turned into the final end product, which is most typically a capsule. And then the product that we have is a freeze-dried product. So when you freeze-dry a product, it actually dries it and it makes it no longer metabolically active. So the bacteria sort of go to sleep and they wake up again when they're exposed to moisture. And so when you give it to your dog, they eat it, and it opens up within the, usually it'll start opening up in the small intestine. And then when it opens up, it gets moisture again and they wake up. So that's the advantage of the freeze drying process. But we don't want to stuff a pill full of fiber and only a little bit of microbes, because you can get fiber cheap in the diet, right? You just give them a little bit of veggies, or you give them a prebiotic fiber supplement, and they'll get everything that they need. So that's the process, is really refining it down to the point where we're really concentrating for the microbes within the gut that are healthy, beneficial, and then it's being turned into a final end product that's a capsule. But I think, you mentioned, we talked about the manufacturing, we talked about the donors, but also the donor screening is really important, because dogs can get pathogens, right? And so we're constantly having the donor screened, both from a general health standpoint, but also testing their stool to make sure there's nothing pathogenic in it. So all of the product that's manufactured, before it even goes into manufacturing, there's a hold period to ensure there's nothing pathogenic, there's no parasites or things in the stool that could otherwise harm a dog that is in a more, unbalanced state, vulnerable health condition, old, cancerous, other things that could put them off if they were exposed to, say, a parasite. So they're constantly being screened. And it's that
Right on.
combination of like a really good donor network that has all of those natural rearing aspects, the manufacturing, which is removing waste products, combined with the donor screening. That's ultimately what gives you both the safety profile and the efficacy profile. So you need all of those things together to make it both safe and effective. And we don't want it to be, it's got to be both, right? If it's just effective, but it's very risky, no one's going to want to do it. And why would you? But if it's just, it's just safe, but moderately effective, what's the point? So it's the combination of those three factors: the donor as a medical history background, how it's reared and raised, how it's fed, combined with the testing to ensure there's nothing pathogenic. And then the manufacturing, again, manufacturing is done in a very clean, not sterile, of course, because this is not a sterile product, but it's done in a very meticulous way to ensure we're not getting exogenous bacteria, right? Stuff from the environment or otherwise that could be coming into the product. So all of those things ultimately give it this safety and efficacy profile. And that's the amazing thing. I mean, humans being the best case for this, but it's been studied in thousands of humans, especially in C. diff. And broadly speaking, as long as those factors are accounted for, donor screening being a big one, it's very safe. And that's important. I think that's a really important piece. And that's something that we want to continue to maintain, because we want this to be safe. We don't want you to be giving something to your dog that's less than safe or that has a risk profile that just doesn't make it worthwhile.
Right on. And that's the thing, is that many of these animals and people that are receiving this transplant have some sort of immune compromise. They're already sick in many cases. So if it were not safe and carefully screened, then it could take a bad situation and really turn it disastrous. So
Yes.
super critical. Right on. So, all right. So we've got this beautiful, safe, effective product. And then you mentioned that most of your product goes into capsules. And how do we know that this is working, not working? How do we kind of track this? And what are some
Sure.
important things to do in terms of diet to make sure we get a high success rate?
Yes, good question. So I think how to know it's working is ultimately, if your dog is symptomatic, you're going to know. You can do testing. I'm not a huge advocate of testing. I think there's advantages for it in certain situations. But ultimately, I think, parlaying the manufacturing part into this, the product is double encapsulated and enteric coated. So what that ultimately means is that the capsule isn't going to begin opening up until it reaches the small bowel. Because if we expose these bacteria to high, it's an acidic environment, which is, low on the pH scale. If they're getting exposed to a lot of pH, they're actually going to start opening up, and the acidic environment is going to begin to kill them. And that's what the acid, among other roles like breaking down proteins, is for. It's for trying to kill off bacteria or things before they get into the small bowel. So that's really the advantage. And that's why we suggest to people, if you can help it, don't open it up. Just mix it in something that they can eat. As far as, because, in some ways it'd be a lot easier just to give it as a powder supplement on top of their food or mixed in their food. But that would just lower the amount of bacteria that actually survive and get through. So they're beginning to open up in the small bowel. And depending on the symptoms, that's what ultimately you're going to be tracking. A lot of people are doing this because their dog has overt symptoms, either diarrhea, which could be C. diff, or Giardia, or all kinds of other infectious things, or they have these symptoms of, say, leaky gut, and that might be behavioral things. They're tired. That could be itching skin. That could be overt skin symptoms. Dry skin, itchy skin, the fungal things that happen in their ears and between their toes and under their legs and armpits and things of that nature. So once those things start improving, you're on the right track. And we typically suggest, 1 to 2 months. The rule of thumb from a treatment standpoint, which is typically just 1 capsule a day for that period of time. If it's a really large dog, which there are some really large ones out there, you may need to increase it to, say, 2 capsules a day. And but ultimately, typically what pet owners will first notice is their dog's stools improve. If they're loose or they're fluctuating a lot, they're going to start firming up and becoming, they'll be more healthy looking. Most people see their dog stool because they got to pick it up. Unless you live out in the woods and they just go do their thing out in the woods, you're going to see it. And so that'll be one of the first signs that something's changing. And then later on, and that from thinking about it in the way that presumably this is working, is we're actually healing the gut integrity, the gut lining, sort of dealing with this leaky gut issue. We're lowering the inflammation. And when that happens, we're not getting these inflammatory things leaking into the rest of the body. And so the skin can start to heal up. And now, as we've talked about the fungal overgrowth, when you start getting the right balance of the microbes, it'll actually suppress the overgrowth of the fungus, and you'll start to see those fungal symptoms improving. And we just had a pet parent that reported back to us where their dog just constantly, and it was a lab or a golden retriever, one of those that just loved water, or was always getting ear infections. And they just kept taking it to the vet, and the vet just kept giving it more antibiotics. So there's nothing really else to do. And it's been several months now, and it just no longer gets these ear infections, which is, again, ties into like the gut is impacting all systems of the body. And the ear has its own microbiome, as does the nose, as does everything has its own microbiome. The skin is its own microbiome. And so by improving the gut microbiome, you're improving these other more local microbiomes, but surely there's an interplay between all of them. So yeah, ultimately it's going to be symptom improvement. But as I pointed out, the more sort of chronic or severe the case, meaning the dog's had these symptoms, say, for years, it's going to take longer to rebuild the microbiome to a healthy state. And so what might happen is the pet's on the treatment and they're slowly improving over time, and they stop and they start to regress. Now, that could be a sign that you need to support the diet more. And that, I'm always going to be an advocate of diet as like the foundational thing. Like, you're wasting your time if you're going to do FMT but continue to have them on a horrible diet. That's just not going to work. I mean, that, or you're just going to have to keep them on the product for life. And although that's a good business case, that's not what we're here for. We want dogs to get well and stay well. And so in those cases, it could be an indication you need to support the diet some more. And to your point of like what to do from a dietary standpoint, I think adding some more diversity is a really key piece. And so regardless on, sort of what camp you're in as far as how you believe dogs should eat or how they should be fed, whether it's all meat or only a little bit of meat or, grains or no grains. I mean, I think we can all agree that having more diversity, even in the types of proteins that they're eating, including the tripe, including some varieties of fruits and veggies and even beans and lentils and so on and so forth. Fermented foods can be really awesome. Sometimes there's kelp that can be great for dogs. There's the iodine, there's a lot of other benefits in it. But I do think that just having a focus on more diversity will expose these microbes, which we got to remember, they only grow and live when exposed to fiber. That is their job. They are breaking down fiber. Our bodies don't have the natural ability to do it. That's why we have a microbiome. That's why we have bacteria to break down and digest these fibers for us. And so there's this mutually beneficial relationship that we have with these bugs where they break down the fiber for us and then we feed them. And so it's a win-win. And as a part of what they're producing short-chain fatty acids, for example, and those short-chain fatty acids are important for lowering inflammation, as well as those short-chain fatty acids are actually the fuel source of the gut cells that line the digestive tract. So that's the healing the leaky gut aspect. So it's this whole interplay. But in a more sort of thinking of this in a chronic and a severe standpoint, there's a lot of dogs with IBD, and that can be pretty severe. And that will, in many cases, take a longer period of treatment. Just an average case, or you're trying to benefit your pet's health overall, you could get away with 1 to 2 months of treatment, and that's going to be great. Maybe, and some pet owners are already beginning to do this, but maybe once a year, you're sort of giving them a round just to kind of replenish, or you're doing like 1 capsule a week, or you do a week every month, or there's different ways of just sort of supporting the dog's microbiome overall. If you want to be more proactive, more preventative, more sort of hitting those longevity targets that we're shooting for. But otherwise, yeah, the more acute, less severe, short course of treatment, more severe, more chronic, they've been dealing with it for a long time. It's going to take longer to rebuild the quality of their microbiome and that structure that we talked about.
Right on. And I think that that is so critical because, I mean, there are FMT products that are specific for raw-fed dogs, and then kibble-fed dogs, and then Dr. Roman's dogs. But what is clear is that the diversity and the richness is not as great in raw-fed dogs as dogs that have exposure to vegetable fibers, because this is indeed what fuels the ability of that microbiome to grow in a healthy way. So
Right.
I think
And
that
even if
message
your dog,
is critical.
right. Yeah, and even if your dog is more on an animal protein diet, it's just going to benefit from getting some more exposure to some plants, some fruits, some of these things that will give it some more of the diversity that would match the microbiome of the donor, which has a lot more of the plant in the diet. So yeah, I think there's really an argument to expand the diet. It can still be a majority raw protein diet, but we know by expanding the fibrous foods, you're just going to support more diversity in the gut, and that is the key. Diversity of the microbiome is the key to its importance. And I think a little analogy here, because I like analogies, it's almost like a human population, right? If you had, you could say, okay, I'm going to create a new community. You wouldn't just take young kids that are 12 to 15. That would be chaos, right? There'd be no wisdom there, and they wouldn't know what to do. Most kids that age today wouldn't even know how to make a sandwich. And you also wouldn't just take elderly people. They'd have the wisdom, but they'd have no ability to reproduce. And you wouldn't just take people that are in their 30s to 40s because, well, they're just focused on working, and there's no one to provide some direction or supporting of the youth or the kids. And so it's really important to think of the importance of diversity, even within a community. A healthy community has diversity across the spectrum. There's no one person within that spectrum that's good or bad. They're all needed to support the health of a vibrant community. And the gut is much the same way. We need diversity of the microbes and enough of them so that we can support this healthy sort of infrastructure that exists and prevent bad overgrowth, right? It's just like in that same community, you need some police. And that's what these, healthy balance of bacteria do. They can police and remove, and the immune system plays a really key role in that as well. There's this like interrelationship between immune and gut, and they talk to each other and they make sure, oh, something's getting out of hand. Let's, send in the troops, and they go and they knock it out. So that's what health is. And that's supporting a diversity of fibers in the diet is ultimately what supports diversity of the bugs, because they all feed on different fiber types. So if you're just only giving one fiber type, you're going to bolster, increase the amount of the microbes or bacteria that are feeding on that fiber type. So that's the key here, is the diversity of the diet supports the diverse microbiome, and the diverse microbiome maintains this healthy balance that supports all of the organ systems.
Right on. So just like the example I gave earlier, where the Trehalose selected for C. diff, we can feed just zucchini, and we will select for certain populations of bugs. But if we add in carrots, for instance, or beets or something like this, we're going to make a much broader spectrum of bugs to populate the gut.
Right.
And
And that's,
so,
I think, it's often a little harder when you have a dog that's older and they've kind of just got like stuck in their ways. But if you have a younger dog, I think it is important to really try to kind of push them out of their comfort zone. Dogs are creatures of habit as well, right? They just get to like, oh, I like this food. And I think it's important, even if it's a little uncomfortable for them, meaning they don't eat for half a day or a day because they're being picky. And maybe it's a food allergy or there's something that they know that we don't. But ultimately, I do think it's important to just try to mix it up often enough to expose them to different things. And then fermented foods can be great, right? I know my dogs, for example, they love the goat kefir. It's like the fermented yogurt. They just love it. And it's awesome. It's really supportive of the gut and the microbiome.
right on. And so it's just like Soleka has done, she's using the whole plant. And if it cooks down really well, super easy for them to digest with great results. And And then Kahu's got a very interesting question. If we don't fix the microbiome first, then will some supplements still work, or will they not absorb it and have full benefits of them?
Yeah, I think that's, our digestive system is ultimately what's helping to break things down and get us to absorb stuff. And so if we're giving supplements, but we're not able to digest and absorb, we're not going to get the benefit. And so, yeah, you're going to want to improve the health of the gut to even better take on the benefits of supplements that you're giving. And so, yeah, if you're doing treatment, and a lot of a lot of vets are treating dogs with, say cancers and things. And if you're getting all kinds of supplements, but the gut health isn't good, you're not going to be able to digest and absorb them well. And the same thing goes for really quality food, right? If your dog has a lot of symptoms, yes, you're still going to want to do a really quality diet. But if they don't have the overall digestive health, which isn't just the microbes, right? It's you mentioned earlier, the digestive enzymes and the bile acids and all of the things that are important, then they're just not going to be able to absorb and get all the benefits from the supplement or the food.
Right on. And I think that's really critical, because what tends to happen for a lot of pet parents is that they're like, oh, the microbiome, that's the solution. And there's the 27 supplements and the FMT and the massive diet change. So if your pet's already depleted or has some issues, do small, easy things. So if you're going to go with FMT, maybe what you want to do first is fix the diet and make it super easy to digest. Your dog is doing well with it before you start introducing other supplements, and just minimize the number of supplements. I mean, if we look at the number of companies out there producing supplements, and I do as well, we could have our pets on 30 different supplements a day, but that sort of defeats the purpose of the concept of supplement. So,
agreed. It's no longer a supplement; it becomes a food. And I agree with you. I mean, nature is, it's designed very well. We didn't have supplements. I don't know how many years ago it became a thing. Let's just say it was 100 years ago where it became predominantly a thing, or more of them were cropping into the market. But the nature is very intelligent. And so it can be supported with nature. And again, I don't think a dog needs to be on anything long term if it's given a healthy, well-balanced diet, love and exercise and exposure to nature and all these things that we know are important. Like, they shouldn't need to be on anything forever. Same with humans. Now, there is a case to be made that the quality of the food that we eat doesn't have all the micronutrients and minerals and things. So there is a case for it. I don't disagree. But to be putting your dog on that amount of supplements just to be functioning well says something's wrong, and that should be addressed. And that would, lead to a lot of cost savings. And so there's huge benefit to just trying to fix the problem at the root, right? Which is what I know you teach, is like this root cause healing, so that the dog could just get well and live a healthy, happy, exuberant life.
Right on, right on. So Audrey's got a great question. She's used your products. So if she's got some extra bottles, do they need to be stored in the refrigerator or just once they're opened?
So they're technically shelf stable at room temperature. So you can just store them at room temperature. However, if you have a supply, I would just keep them in the fridge. It doesn't take up much space. The temperature is more even keel, and depending where you live, Audrey, if you're in Florida, the fluctuations are huge, right? They're exposed to a lot of humidity potentially, even though the bottle contains for that. But yeah, personally, I would just keep them in the fridge. There's really no harm in shelf stable and just storing them on the shelf. But if you have a choice, fridge is the easy way to go.
Right on. And Mary's asking, what about cats? That's not you guys don't have a cat product as yet, do you?
As yet, but we will come June.
Exciting.
Yes.
Very exciting.
We've been getting a lot of feedback from the cat lovers, and I'm one of them. Currently we have, just personal pets. We have 2 cats and we have 2 dogs. So I equally love them. Although, sometimes cats are even nicer than the dogs. They're just, I sort
they
of
can
like
be easier for sure.
Yeah, there's that too, for sure. But they're kind of like not in your face like dogs are, right? Like, dogs are demanding that they need attention, and then they get it. versus cats are like happy if you give it to them, but they're not going to like create a fit if you don't give them attention. Although there's exceptions, of course, and that is a very cute dog.
Thank you. She was like, I have to go on screen. This is IO. So she had to,
I gotta
she had to put in
represent
her
dogs.
appearance.
So yeah,
Come
so
on,
we're
man.
going to be taking many of the same principles that we have from a donor history and standpoint and applying it to the cat product. So it's going to be a very similar product ultimately with the same, everything that we talked about for dogs, but for cats. So very excited about that. And, ultimately, if people want to stay in the loop, my best suggestion is like just subscribe to the newsletter on our website, and they'll be able to find. We'll notify people that are sort of subscribers first, because as we well know, most people that have dogs also have cats, and so we'll be letting the people that subscribe know first. And I do think it's going to be a very popular product, and so it may be hard to keep on the shelves, frankly.
I think you were probably right. Cats tend to get hind teat, as the expression goes, in terms of things that could develop. So that's super awesome. And I've just dropped the link to the Legacy Biome site there, so you can go in and check it out. Let's see, you've got a couple of more questions in here. So this is pretty interesting. Patty's dog, sadly, was recently diagnosed with diabetes. Have you seen examples of dogs with diabetes who've been helped by FMT?
I don't know the answer to that question from a pet standpoint. I'd have to look to see if there have been any studies done in dogs, but in humans, absolutely. There's definitely a huge interplay, and so I'm just making that translation to the pets between the role that the microbiome has in the progression of diabetes. Huge role there. Now, that's not to say that I think that by taking an FMT, doing a fecal transplant, that you're going to reverse the diabetes and they're no longer going to need the support. And I don't know precisely, what you're doing at this point, Patty, but I do think, yes, there's a huge role that the microbiome plays in the development even of diabetes and then the progression of it. So, yeah, but no specific examples that I can share.
And I think you're right. I mean, unfortunately, we just don't have much research in the dog world. But if we know that certain types of bugs will drive us to certain behaviors, and also drive our metabolism to behave in a certain way, I think it makes a great deal of sense that supporting the microbiome, along with doing all of the other things that we would do to support a diabetic dog, like getting rid of the ultra processed foods, going with whole food diets, using things that will help to minimize the impact of insulin resistance on the cells. So reducing starchies, using slow burn carbs like lentils, that kind of stuff. I think that would be critical.
Agreed.
And I can't see
just walking them, like getting enough walking in through regular intervals a day will make a huge difference.
Right on. So all of the things, and then if we support the microbiome or help to replace it over time, I think this is a great chance to heal this dog. And along with the studies in people that have shown keto diet helping to put diabetes in remission, we see similar results with pets. I can't quote a study, but that's what I was able to see for so many of my patients by either going to a keto version of a diet or just simply pulling the fast burning carbohydrates out. We were able to get many dogs into a much better situation, and in some cases,
I
reverse the diabetes.
I believe it can be reversed, depending on how progressed, of course, it is. But the combination of diet, exercise, and in the context of this conversation, improving the microbiome is going to play a huge role. And there's a lot of herbs and things as well that can be supportive of pets and humans with diabetes that can be considered herbs and nutrients. So yeah, it's good. I saw there was a question here. Where was it now? I don't know where it went, but it was about Salika as well. Is the product resilient to temperatures? What if I use them in baked treats at home? So if you're to do that, I wouldn't bake them with the treat. I would add it after the fact. because we know heat will kill bacteria. And so everything from a manufacturing standpoint, it's always kept cool because we don't want it to be exposed to heat, because heat is the death of bacteria. Now, you're probably not killing everything. There's some that are definitely more heat resistant than others, but you will be reducing some of the microbes within the product. So if you're making a treat, I would just put it in the treat after the fact, not cook it with it. But also it comes in like it's not plastic, but what pills are made out of, right? It's like this fibrous stuff that will start to degrade as well if you were to keep it in there. But if you're just adding the powder into a treat, that's different. But I would avoid heat.
And also, if you're taking it out of the capsule, then you're going to have even more loss of the efficacy of the product because it's exposed to stomach acid.
Yeah, and Lisa mentions that here. She had a 6-pound Yorkie. It's a good point. Maybe we ought to make like a toy breed size, because we do have some people who it's a lot harder when you get these tiny capsules. And you're right. We do tell people to not open them. The exception is if there's no other way to do it, you're still going to get the advantage of doing it orally and as a powder. Like, it's not going to kill everything. It's just that it's going to be better to if it weren't opened. But if that's the only way to get it in, I get it. Lisa will take the feedback and we'll consider that idea. I know it's come up a few times. It's unreal. Like, you have a 6-pound Yorkie. There's some people that have like a 3-pound dog. It's like hard to believe that there's a dog even that small. But you're still going to get benefit. It just may not be the same. You may need to treat for a little longer or things of that nature. But I would. You're not harming your dog. It's just that they're not getting the full dose. So you're still going to do them a benefit by giving it to them as a powder, even not in a capsule.
Right on. And so, I mean, you can purchase, like, you probably have like a double lot size capsule for most of this stuff.
Yes.
But
so
you
we do
can
a
purchase
small size, which is size 0, and a small and a 0. But to Lisa's point, they're double encapsulated. And so an option would be to take off the outer capsule, and then it's a size 1. So it's a little smaller yet. But that is an option. It would be a little smaller, maybe still not small enough for a 6-pound Yorkie. But it really varies with dogs too, right? Like my dogs, for example, if I give it to them, they love food, right? So if I just put it, like, sometimes there's pill putty and things you can make yourself or you can buy them, but I'll just get like a little piece of pepperoni, something like that, and just slide it into the middle of it, and they just gobble it back. But some dogs they're not very food motivated. They're not very treat motivated. And so I totally get it. It can be a little trickier. Some dogs, you put it in their food and they're licking around the thing. They're interesting. So you definitely have to get creative, no doubt.
Liverwurst and Vienna sausages, 2 of the most frightening meat products in the world, but really excellent for getting pills to disappear.
Exactly. I mean, you can just, open their mouth and pop it in too, if you want to be a little more, I don't know. It's obviously a little, it doesn't feel good to like force your dog in that context, but if you really need to get it in, you can.
Butter is a real, we have
Good
to
lubricant.
do this with Hayo. Just lube it up with butter, and then she gets a piece of cheese or something afterwards.
Right. Yeah.
Now, Lenny, I wanted to answer this question. So a GDV, a gastric dilatation and volvulus, this is an emergency situation. So if this is an on again, off again thing, that probably isn't a GDV, hopefully. But dogs get SIBO too. So
that's what I was going to consider.
Yeah, exactly.
So it could be a SIBO situation.
Yeah. Right. So small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, and this happens for a myriad of reasons, but most often after having had either a food poisoning or some round of antibiotics or a couple of other bits and pieces. So this is so what about FMT for these guys?
Yeah, this is really exciting. And I say a prior life, but I used to treat just a whack of SIBO patients, humans. And I'm talking hundreds over several years. My learning at the end of it all is that SIBO, a small intestinal overgrowth, is actually started by a colonic, a large bowel overgrowth or imbalance. And so it's a dysbiosis that starts in the large intestine and then begins to translate up into the small bowel. And you would think, right? I mean, if SIBO is truly a bacterial overgrowth in the small intestine, FMT would cause SIBO. It's opening up in the small bowel, except that's not happening. It's actually reducing bloating and distension and abdominal pain. And there's studies using FMT orally to resolve SIBO. And so there's absolutely a case for FMT in the context of SIBO.
Yeah, I'm a witness.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so that's the, you can control the diet to remove foods that would feed the overgrowth, and you can take supplements and you can take medications, and sometimes that might be necessary, frankly. I mean, in some cases it can progress so far where the distension and discomfort and pain and all of that is so severe, you're going to want to do something to knock it back. But the long-term strategy needs to be rebuilding the large bowel. And that's why the relapse rates are really so high, because we're not dealing with the actual problem, which is the distal overgrowth that's happening or the imbalance that's happening in the large bowel that then translates into the small. So I've never, in humans and of course, in dogs, we've never seen that this has caused or worsened SIBO. It actually helps resolve it. In some cases, I do think some pre-treatment could be beneficial, right? To just knock down the overgrowth, get rid of some of this discomfort. And then ultimately, again, once you've rebuilt the large bowel, you can support the diet and getting more diversity in to help rebuild and refuel the microbes that are there.
Right on. And that's it. I mean, giving probiotics or taking probiotics if you have SIBO is just not possible, because they open up way too high. And ultimately, they never get the chance to get down and really recolonize lower in the gut.
Yeah, and I mean, that's a key distinction between FMT and probiotics, right? A probiotic will not engraft. It doesn't become a part of your gut microbiome. And that's the key difference between FMT and a probiotic, is that the microbes a part of FMT actually engraft. They stay there. Probiotics can have some transient benefits, and there's a lot of research on them. There's a lot of people that make a lot of money with probiotics, and so they're really trying to push them. And I'm not anti-probiotics necessarily, but they just work very differently. And you're going to need to be on them long term if you're getting benefits today. If you stop in a week, any of those benefits are likely to be gone. And so you're not able to rebuild the gut microbiome through a probiotic alone. And in fact, we suggest people avoid probiotics during FMT because it's throwing off this balance. It's like adding this new variable, and we're trying to train the microbiome. It's like, this is what's healthy. And so we don't want to be pushing a few select strains to create an imbalance that isn't healthy.
Right on. And I think that's so critical, right? Because I think probiotics can be helpful, but in the face of FMT, absolutely not, because it's like we have this beautiful recipe for an incredible stew, and then we throw in some bizarre ingredient that just totally whacks the taste profile. Right on. And Mary, there is, so Animal Biome does indeed currently have an FMT product for cats. And so they have a lot of stuff. And so that if you're struggling with something and you can't wait till June, this is a place to go check it out. But I would definitely get on the mailing list for Legacy Biome to see kind of what they're coming up with. Cool. And let's see. So this is an interesting thing, right? So are prebiotics like psyllium husk, inulin, FOS, et cetera, better, or are whole food-based fiber prebiotics going to feed the FMT bacteria best?
Yeah, I mean, I'm always going to be an advocate of trying to get it out of the diet. Giving fermented foods and things of that nature, just a variety is always going to be good. I don't, again, you're also with these, they're very specific fibers. And so you're only feeding specific strains of bacteria that are going to grow. And so there's definitely, you could cycle between these. You can, play around with them, using a bunch of them to get more diversity. But I just think it's easier just to get it from the food. and it's going to give them the full spectrum versus just FOS or just inulin. But it can definitely be supportive. And I think if you're going to do it, do a bunch of different things all at once. Don't just, again, focus on, oh, I'm just going to hammer inulin. That could create its own imbalance.
Right on. And again, you're feeding specific things that are going to select for specific organisms rather than feeding the whole pie, so to speak. Let's see, and Randy's asking, is it beneficial to prepare the gut with S. boulardii before doing FMT?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think of the probiotics that exist on the market, I think S. boulardii, Saccharomyces is a pretty interesting one. I do think, especially in the context of a case where there's a lot of fungal overgrowth, S. boulardii can actually help reduce the fungal overgrowth. And in humans getting FMT treatment for C. diff, it's been identified that if there's too much of a fungal overgrowth, we're not getting engraftment and we're not resolving the C. diff overgrowth. And so in some cases, I do think there's a case for trying to lower the fungal overgrowth, kind of like I mentioned with the SIBO, like reducing it a bit so that we can get in and do the job with the full spectrum of the gut microbiome through FMT. And so, yes, I do think there's a role to play there as a bit of a prep, and then pause it while doing FMT.
Makes sense. And Patty, what you missed is that hopefully in June, Legacy Biome is going to have a product available for cats, which is super cool. So again, I dropped the link for the website there. Jason, you all have a really nice Facebook group as well, where all things FMT are discussed. So I'm dropping the link there too.
Cool.
And yeah. And Patty, yeah, food grade diatomaceous earth. I do not know why people think it's a good idea to feed this, because basically you're putting sand through your dog's gut. And the way it works is to lacerate the eggs and larvae of critters in the external environment. And so there's some idea that, oh, you can use this for parasites, but I think this is going to just muck up the microbiome. And have you experienced this with people doing?
Yeah, I know a lot of times people are advocates of some people become advocates of it. I think in a really, if someone's health is really bad, I mean, this could be something to do it. But as a general supportive therapy, I mean, I take a very sort of different and sometimes unique approach to health and well-being. I think it's much like diplomacy. You can either fight to create diplomacy, or you can try to create peace through negotiation and support. And I just don't think that long term we're going to be well off by trying to kill our way to health. It just doesn't work. The body needs to be supported to health. And in some contexts, you do need to do some selective killing. So I'm not suggesting that, if there's a C. diff infection or your dog has giardia and horrible diarrhea and blood and mucus, we need to do something here acutely. That's a very different thing. But if your dog is sick and they're just struggling long term and you've tried killing all sorts of stuff and they keep getting sick, we need to kind of create a different lens that we're looking at this through and think about creating health through supporting the dog and the systems that have been evolved over thousands of years to work very, very well. We need to support that. And stop doing the things that we know are harming the system and creating imbalance and disease. So that's really just rethinking, how do we want to get to health? Do we want to fight and kill our way there? Or do we want to try to support this innate intelligence that is our human biology? And that to me is the sustainable path to getting there. It might not be as fast because we don't see immediate changes, although we can in some contexts. But it's the long-term way to health and well-being.
And I think that makes a great deal of sense. Logic, cool. And Patty, I'm glad you're not feeding it. I think topically it's okay. DE is okay, but yes, it's going to alter the microbiome in the yard, but you're also not spraying pesticides. So you got to kind of, right? So it's that balance. What's good and not so harmful, but helps protect our pet from fleas and things. Cool. Jason, thank you so much. Really appreciate your time today. This has been a fun session. Everybody seems to have enjoyed it. So
Likewise, I appreciate the opportunity to share, and look forward to staying in touch.
right on. Cool. All right, everybody have a great day. We'll see you next week. Thanks.